I gave my son my house, my life savings, and every ounce of my trust, only for his new wife to call the police and claim I was a threat to my own grandchildren. I spent 40 years building a legacy of honor and hard work, but in 40 minutes, I was standing on a public sidewalk with nothing but a suitcase and a heart full of confusion. What my son did not know was that his perfect wife was the daughter of a woman I had sent to prison 30 years ago, and she was not there for the inheritance. She was there for blood. If you want to see how a grandfather fights back when he has been stripped of everything but his memories, stay with me until the very last word. My name is Arthur. I am 72 years old, and until last Tuesday, I believed I was the luckiest man in Virginia. I lived in a sprawling Victorian farmhouse that had been in my family for 3 generations. It sat on 60 acres of prime timberland, with a wraparound porch that smelled of honeysuckle in the summer and wood smoke in the winter. When my wife Martha passed away 5 years ago, the house felt too big, too quiet, and too full of ghosts. So when my son David suggested he and his new wife Chloe move in to help me keep up with the place, I thought it was a blessing. I was so blinded by the prospect of having my grandchildren, Leo and Maya, running through those halls again, that I did the one thing a man in my position should never do. I signed over the deed. I wanted them to feel secure. I wanted them to know that this was their home. For the first year, it was a dream. Chloe was the image of the perfect daughter-in-law. She brought me tea in the mornings. She asked for my advice on the garden, and she made sure the kids spent every evening in my study listening to my stories about the old days. But then, things began to change. It started with small comments. A misplaced set of keys. A burner left on the stove that I was certain I had turned off. Chloe began to look at me with a soft, pitying expression whenever David was in the room. She would whisper to him just loud enough for me to hear about how worried she was. She started using terms like cognitive decline and sundowning. The trap was sprung on Leo's 5th birthday. It was a beautiful Saturday in June. The yard was filled with balloons, and half the town was there. I had spent weeks restoring an old pedal car for Leo, a heavy metal thing I had played with as a boy. When it was time for cake, I went to the garage to fetch it. When I returned to the patio, Chloe was standing there, her face a mask of simulated terror. She screamed, claiming I had swung the heavy metal car at her, that I had a wild look in my eye, and was mumbling about people who weren't there. David rushed over, and before I could even open my mouth to defend myself, the police were pulling into the driveway. Chloe had called them 10 minutes before I even came out of the garage. She had staged the whole thing. As the officers led me away for a mandatory psychiatric evaluation, I saw her. Standing at the edge of the property, near the old oak tree, was a woman I hadn't seen in 3 decades. She was older, her hair a sharp dyed blonde, but I would know those cold, calculating eyes anywhere. It was Meredith. 30 years ago, she had been the head bookkeeper for the school district where I served as superintendent. I had caught her embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars meant for the special education program. I had been the star witness in the trial that sent her to the state penitentiary for 10 years. She didn't move, she didn't wave, she simply watched as the patrol car door closed on me. In that split second, the fog cleared. Chloe wasn't just a difficult daughter-in-law. She was Meredith's daughter. This wasn't about a house or a garden. This was a long-term, multi-generational hit on my life. They had waited until I was at my most vulnerable, until I had given away my legal rights to my property, to strike. I spent 72 hours in a sterile hospital room being poked and prodded by doctors. They found nothing wrong with my mind. I was as sharp as a tack, but that didn't matter. Chloe had used those 72 hours to obtain a temporary restraining order. When I was finally released, I was told I could not go within 500 feet of my own home. My clothes and a few personal items had been left in a suitcase at the local motel. I sat on the edge of the bed in that motel room, the smell of stale cigarettes and cheap carpet cleaner filling my lungs. I looked at the suitcase. They hadn't even packed my wedding album. They hadn't packed the medals I earned in the service. They had left me with 3 changes of clothes and a sense of absolute ruin. I called David, but he wouldn't answer. He had been convinced by Chloe that I was a ticking time bomb, that my presence was a danger to his children. My own son believed I was a monster because he had been fed a steady diet of lies for 18 months. But they forgot one thing. Meredith was a thief, but I was a record keeper. I had spent my entire career documenting everything. When I testified against Meredith 30 years ago, I didn't just hand over the evidence the prosecutors asked for. I kept a private file of every piece of correspondence, every ledger, and every person she had ever associated with. I had a safety deposit box at a bank in the next county over that neither David nor Chloe knew existed. I took a taxi to the bank the next morning. My hands were shaking as I turned the key in the lock. Inside that box was a ledger that Meredith would have killed to get her hands on back in the 90s. It contained the names of the silent partners who had helped her launder the stolen money, people who were now very prominent figures in our state government. And tucked into the back of that ledger was a birth certificate I had found during my investigation, but never had the chance to use because she had already been convicted. It was the birth certificate for a girl named Chloe, born while Meredith was awaiting trial. I realized then that Chloe's marriage to David wasn't just a way to get the house. It was a way to get to the land. Underneath the back 40 acres of my property, there is a vein of high-grade limestone that a major construction company has been trying to buy for years. I had always refused to sell because it would ruin the environment and the heritage of the farm. But with me out of the picture and the deed in David and Chloe's names, they could sign the mineral rights away for millions. Meredith was going to get the money she felt the world owed her, and she was going to use my grandson's inheritance to do it. I spent the next 3 days in the public library, using their computers to track the recent filings at the county recorder's office. Sure enough, a shell company had been formed just 6 months ago, with Chloe listed as the primary officer. The company was already in negotiations with the limestone quarry. They were planning to strip mine my family's soul while I sat in a motel room waiting to die. I am not a man who seeks revenge for the sake of hurting others. But I am a man who believes in the sanctity of the home. I decided that if Meredith wanted to use the past to destroy my future, I would use her past to bury her present. I reached out to an old friend, a retired judge who knew the truth about the embezzlement case. I told him everything. I told him about the restraining order, the fake dementia, and the daughter who was finishing her mother's work. Stay with me for part 2, because the battle for the farmhouse is about to turn into a high-stakes game of legal chess. I am going back to that property, but I am not going back with an apology. I am going back with a sheriff and a secret that will make Meredith wish she had stayed in that prison cell 30 years ago. Do you think David will believe me when he sees the proof, or has Chloe's poison gone too deep? I walked back onto my own property not as a grandfather, but as a man with a warrant for the truth. Chloe thought she had erased me, but she forgot that a man who spent 40 years in the school system knows exactly how to handle a bully who thinks they are smarter than the teacher. If you want to see the moment the perfect daughter-in-law realized her 30-year scheme was falling apart, you cannot afford to miss what happens next. Before we get into the heat of this confrontation, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with the word truth if you think justice is finally coming for Chloe and Meredith. Have you ever had a family member try to steal what you worked your whole life to build? Let me know your story in the comments below, and let us see if anyone can guess the final move I'm about to make. The motel room was a cramped, miserable place, but it became my war room. For 3 days, I worked with Judge Miller, a man who had seen the worst of humanity from his bench and still believed in the law. We didn't just look at the deed I had signed over to David. We looked at the way it was obtained. In the state of Virginia, if a contract is signed under undue influence or through fraudulent misrepresentation, it can be challenged. And Chloe had misrepresented herself from the very first day she met my son. Judge Miller found the thread we needed. The shell company Chloe had set up to sell the limestone rights was funded by an offshore account that traced back to a name I recognized from the original embezzlement trial. Meredith hadn't just been a thief. She had been a partner to some very dangerous, very wealthy people who had never been caught. They were using Chloe to finally get the land they had coveted for decades. I didn't wait for a court date. I knew that every hour I spent in that motel was an hour they spent stripping the farmhouse of its history. I called the local sheriff, a man I had known since he was a boy in my middle school. I told him I needed a civil standby to retrieve essential medical documents from the house. It was a legal way to get past the restraining order for a limited window of time. When we pulled up the long gravel driveway, the sight broke my heart. Chloe had already started removing Martha's rose bushes. A large yellow excavator was parked near the old barn, and surveyor's stakes were driven into the earth of the back pasture. They weren't waiting for me to die. They were starting the demolition while my coffee was still cold in the motel. David came out of the house first. He looked tired, his eyes shadowed with guilt and confusion. "Dad, you shouldn't be here," he said, his voice cracking. The court said. The sheriff stepped forward. "It is a civil standby, David. Your father has a right to his medical records and personal files. We are going to the study." Chloe appeared in the doorway, her face shifting from a look of triumph to one of calculated concern. "David, honey, call the lawyer. He is harassing us again. He is going to hurt someone." I didn't look at her. I walked straight past her, through the hallway that still smelled of the wax Martha used on the floors, and into my study. I went to the floorboard under the heavy oak desk, a spot only I knew about. I pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. It contained the personal logs I had kept during the first year Chloe moved in. I had recorded every time she moved my keys, every time she whispered to David, and every time she had mentioned the limestone. But that was just the beginning. I turned to my son, who had followed us into the room. "David, I need you to look at this." I handed him the birth certificate and the records of the shell company. I showed him the link between his wife and the woman who had tried to bankrupt this county 30 years ago. I showed him the signatures on the quarry contract, signatures that had been made weeks before I was even kicked out of the house. If you are still watching, you are about to see the exact moment the predator realized she had become the prey. The look on Chloe's face when she realized I had found the connection to her mother was something I will never forget. Chloe tried to snatch the papers, but the sheriff moved between us. "David," she said, her voice rising into a panicked sob. "He is making things up. He is obsessed with that old trial. He is trying to drive us apart so he can keep the house to himself." David looked at the birth certificate. He looked at the name Meredith Miller. He looked at his wife, and for the first time in 3 years, he really saw her. "Chloe," he whispered, "why is your mother's maiden name on this document? You told me your mother died in a car accident when you were a baby." She didn't have an answer. The silence in the room was deafening. Just then, a silver Mercedes pulled into the driveway. Meredith herself stepped out of the car, looking like she owned the world. She walked into the house as if she were a guest of honor. But when she saw me standing there with the sheriff and the judge, her face turned the color of ash. "Hello, Meredith," I said. "I see you finally found a way back to my land. But you made a mistake. You taught your daughter how to steal, but you didn't teach her how to cover her tracks." The sheriff took the ledger I had brought from the bank. "Meredith, we have some questions about the funding of this shell company and a few outstanding matters regarding the restitution you never fully paid to the state." The confrontation in that study was the beginning of the end for their scheme. But Meredith was a woman who had survived prison once, and she wasn't about to go back without a fight. She looked at Chloe, and then she looked at me with a hatred that felt like a physical heat. "You think this is over?" she hissed. "You think a few old papers are going to stop a multi-million-dollar contract? This house is in David's name now, and David is going to do exactly what his wife tells him to do." She turned to David, her voice dropping into a soothing, motherly tone. "David, think of your children. Think of the money that will pay for their college, their weddings, their entire lives. Your father is an old man living in the past. We are the future." I looked at my son. I saw the struggle in his eyes. He was caught between the father who had raised him and the life he had built with a woman he thought he loved. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like it would snap. "I am not leaving without the truth, David," I said. "And I am not leaving until you realize that if you sign those papers, you aren't just selling the land. You are selling your soul to the woman who tried to destroy your father before you were even born." Just as the sheriff was about to lead us out, the front door burst open. It was a man I didn't recognize, a representative from the quarry company, looking frantic. "We have a problem," he shouted, not realizing the room was full of law enforcement. "The environmental impact study just came back. There is a protected species of orchid in the back 40, and the state has just issued a permanent injunction. The land is worth nothing for mining. The contract is dead." The look on Meredith's face shifted from rage to pure, unadulterated shock. The million she had gambled everything on had vanished in a single sentence. And then, Chloe did something I never expected. She looked at her mother, and then she looked at the sheriff, and she started to talk. Stay tuned for the final part of this story, where the secrets of the garden are finally laid bare. I am going to tell you how I reclaimed my home, how I dealt with a son who had betrayed me, and the final shocking twist involving Meredith's partner that no one saw coming. Will I be able to forgive David, or is the damage to our family permanent? The ending will show you that even the most carefully planted seeds of revenge can be choked out by the truth. Do you think David deserves to be forgiven for siding with Chloe, or should I leave him to face the consequences of his choices? I stood in the center of the home I had built with my bare hands and my late wife's love, watching the walls of a 30-year conspiracy crumble around the women who thought they could bury me. The money was gone, the contract was dead, and as the sirens returned to my driveway, I realized that the greatest weapon I had wasn't a ledger or a deed, but the cowardice of a daughter who had never truly known what it meant to be a family. If you want to see the final price of betrayal, and how I handled a son who had broken my heart, stay with me until the very last sentence. The silence that followed the quarry representative's announcement was the loudest sound I have ever heard. Meredith stood there, her mouth slightly open, her expensive silk scarf fluttering in the breeze from the open door. All that planning, all that manipulation, and all those years of waiting for revenge had been undone by a tiny, rare flower growing in the dirt she despised. To her, the land was just a paycheck. To the earth, it was a sanctuary. Chloe was the first to break. She was never as strong as her mother. She was a creature of comfort and convenience, and as soon as the prospect of wealth vanished, so did her loyalty. She looked at the sheriff, her eyes wide and wet with tears that I knew were purely for herself. "It was her," Chloe sobbed, pointing a shaking finger at Meredith. "She told me David was an easy mark. She told me his father was a senile old man who wouldn't notice the missing money. She made me do the research on the limestone. She even coached me on how to fake the incident with the pedal car. I just wanted a nice life, but she was obsessed with making Arthur pay." Meredith turned on her daughter with a look of pure venom. "Shut up, you stupid girl," she hissed. "I did this for you. I did this so you wouldn't have to grow up poor like I did after they took everything from me." "You didn't grow up poor, Meredith," I said, stepping forward. "Your family had plenty of money. You were just greedy. You stole from children with special needs because you thought you were better than the rules, and you used your own daughter to try to finish the job." But the story wasn't over. I looked at the sheriff and then back at the ledger I had retrieved from the safety deposit box. There was one more name in there that I hadn't revealed yet. "Meredith, you didn't do this alone 30 years ago, and you didn't do this alone now. You had a partner who helped you funnel the money into the offshore accounts that funded Chloe's lifestyle." I turned to the man from the quarry company who was trying to slip out the door. His name was Edward, and he was the brother of the man who had been the chairman of the school board back when I was superintendent. He had been the one whispering in David's ear about the mining rights, posing as a family friend. He was the one who had linked Meredith and Chloe back together to facilitate the land grab. The sheriff didn't let Edward leave. It turns out that when you start digging into one fraud, you find a dozen others. Edward and Meredith had been laundering money through shell companies for years, and this land deal was supposed to be their final big score. They were going to strip the land, take the millions, and leave David and the kids with a poisoned wasteland and a pile of legal debt. Midpoint rehook. Just when I thought the nightmare was ending, I looked at David. He was standing by the window, his head in his hands, shaking with a grief so profound it made my own anger feel small. He realized that every kiss from his wife, every sweet word from his mother-in-law, and every plan for the future had been a calculated lie. He had been the bait in a trap set for his own father. The legal fallout was swift. With Chloe's confession and the evidence in my ledger, the district attorney had more than enough to file charges of extortion, fraud, and conspiracy. Meredith was taken away in handcuffs, her face a mask of frozen rage. She didn't look at me as she left. She was already planning her next move in her head, but this time there would be no family to help her. Chloe was arrested as well, though her cooperation would likely lead to a lighter sentence. She was led out crying for David, but he didn't even look up. When the house was finally quiet again and the sheriff's cars had disappeared down the driveway, David and I were left in the study. The sun was beginning to set, casting long golden shadows across the floorboards. "Dad," David said, his voice a broken whisper, "I don't even know how to ask for your forgiveness. I let them treat you like a dog. I believed her over you. I almost let them destroy everything." I looked at my son. I saw the little boy who used to follow me through the woods. I saw the man who had been blinded by a love he thought was real. "I am not going to tell you it doesn't hurt, David," I said. "I am not going to tell you that the trust will come back tomorrow. You threw me out of the home your mother and I built. You let a stranger tell you your father was a danger to your children." I paused, letting the weight of the words settle. But I also know that they were professionals. They spent years grooming you. They exploited your desire to provide for your family. I can forgive the man who was deceived, but I cannot forget the man who didn't fight for the truth. I didn't give him the house back. Not that day. I went to court and had the deed transfer vacated based on fraud. The farm is back in my name. David is living in a small apartment in town now, working 2 jobs to pay back the legal fees and to support his children. He comes over every weekend, but he doesn't stay in the main house. He stays in the guest cottage, and we work the garden together in silence. Leo and Maya are with me most of the time. They are young enough that the trauma of that day has faded into a fuzzy memory. They know their mother is away, and they know their grandfather is the one who keeps the monsters under the bed at bay. One afternoon, while I was sitting on the porch watching the kids play near the old oak tree, I saw a single orchid blooming in the grass. It was a small, delicate thing, easily overlooked, yet it had been strong enough to stop a multi-million-dollar demolition. It reminded me that the truth doesn't have to be loud to be powerful. It just has to be there. I am 72 years old, and I am starting over. The garden is empty of the weeds that tried to choke it, but the soil is still rich. David and I are replanting the roses Martha loved so much. It is slow work, and sometimes our hands bleed from the thorns, but we are doing it together. Meredith is back in a cell, and Chloe is serving her time in a minimum security facility. They have no more power over us. The long shadow of the past has finally been shortened by the light of the present. I look at my family, scarred but standing, and I know that justice isn't just about punishment. It is about reclaiming what was lost and protecting what remains. Do you think a family can ever truly heal from a betrayal of this magnitude? Or will the scars always be visible? And what would you do to ensure that someone like Meredith could never find their way back into your life again? Thank you for staying with me through this story of the empty garden.
My grandpa's words really happened. I believe him. If you want more true tales like this, hit subscribe.